everyone, welcome back. Today I'm bringing you a real-world camera comparison between the Huawei Mate 80 Pro Max and the Xiaomi 17 Ultra. These two phones have sparked a lot of debate online, especially around photography performance. So the big question is, how do they actually shoot in everyday scenarios? In this video, we'll put them head-to-head, see where each one shines and where they fall short. Let's jump right in. A quick shout out to my tech partner from China for sharing this video. A big thank you for making this possible. Hey everyone, it's Mickey from TechMakey. If you love staying updated with the latest gadgets, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss out on our exciting tech content. First up, let's talk about the camera hardware. I've already put the detailed specs on the screen so you can follow along easily. The Huawei Mate 80 Pro Max comes with a 50 megapixel main camera using a 1.28-inch sensor. For zoom, it relies on two periscope telephoto lenses, offering 4x and 6.2x optical zoom. It also includes Huawei's second-generation RGB primary color camera. On the other side, the Xiaomi 17 Ultra uses a 50 megapixel main camera with a larger 1-inch sensor. Its telephoto system supports lossless zoom from 3.2x to 4.3x, and instead of using a dual telephoto setup, Xiaomi sticks with a single lens solution. Looking at focal lengths, Huawei's main camera is equivalent to 24 millimeters, while Xiaomi's is slightly wider at 23 millimeters, giving Xiaomi a marginally broader field of view. Metering is another key difference. Huawei relies on matrix metering, whereas Xiaomi prefers center-weighted metering, and this leads to very different image processing approaches. Huawei aims for overall balance. When shooting a sunset, for example, it preserves sky layers by darkening the foreground, letting greenery blend into the atmosphere. Xiaomi, however, locks onto the subject and uses the green foreground as the exposure reference, producing extremely accurate greens, but sacrificing sky detail and color in the process. In simple terms, one focuses on mood while the other focuses on precision. Another standout difference is Huawei's variable aperture on the main camera. When shooting point light sources under sunlight, its mechanical structure easily produces starburst effects, something Xiaomi can't replicate in the same way. Detail processing also separates these two phones. When photographing high-contrast text displays, both devices push sharpening and edge enhancement quite hard. This boosts perceived clarity, but also makes the image look harsh and less natural. Huawei takes a more aggressive approach, making whites brighter and blacks deeper, which creates strong contrast but also more noticeable edge artifacts. Xiaomi plays it safer, slightly lowering exposure so whites appear a bit gray, resulting in smoother and softer transitions. These algorithmic differences become even clearer with complex natural textures. Huawei heavily boosts texture contrast and clarity, making even the smallest lines appear extremely sharp. The upside is striking, eye-catching images, but the downside is that natural transitions can be lost, giving photos a more digital look. Xiaomi's processing is much more restrained, with gentler edge transitions. Small numbers and fine details look closer to what you'd see with your own eyes, although at first glance the images can feel flatter. When shooting architectural details, the contrast between the two becomes even more obvious. Zooming in on roof eaves, Huawei manages to preserve subtle lines and textures quite faithfully. Xiaomi, however, shows clear algorithm misjudgments. Its noise reduction and compositing smooth out complex textures, then reconstruct them into grid-like patterns, leading to visible distortion. The way both phones handle color fringing also reflects their priorities. Huawei's push for high contrast and deep skies can introduce slight purple fringing along high contrast edges. Xiaomi prioritizes clean edges, even if that means accepting a slightly gray sky, showing a more cautious and selective algorithmic approach. Dynamic range handling is another area where they differ. Huawei uses generous exposure combined with intelligent HDR to lift dark areas like walls and air conditioners while maintaining the overall dim atmosphere and shadow relationships, resulting in a more natural look. Xiaomi instead lowers exposure with a faster shutter, then aggressively boosts dark regions afterward. This makes walls appear unnaturally white and completely wipes out the original shadowy mood. Switching to high-resolution modes, Huawei's 50 megapixel shots resemble its so-called doomsday style with very white backgrounds and very black text. The difference here is that the heavy edge sharpening is turned off, so edges look smoother and more natural. Xiaomi's high pixel mode remains conservative with exposure, again leading to slightly gray whites and softer text. This suggests that Xiaomi's color separations and struggles in high-resolution mode, affecting fine line clarity. This isn't a one-off issue either, as another set of high-pixel samples shows the same behavior. At 2x zoom, which is digital zoom from the main camera on both phones, there isn't much difference when shooting smooth subjects like cars. But when photographing textured walls, Huawei tends to mistake irregular grain for noise and applies strong noise reduction. The result is a very clean wall that loses its natural character, almost like it's been edited. Xiaomi keeps the wall's texture intact and even enhances it slightly, making every mark and crack clearly visible. Moving on to telephoto performance, Huawei uses two fixed focus lenses to handle zoom from 4x to 6.2x. The difference in image quality between these lenses is noticeable, and digital zoom beyond that shows a clear drop in quality. Xiaomi relies on a single telephoto lens with lossless zoom from 3.2x to 4.3x, so image quality stays consistent within that range. In terms of equivalent focal length, Huawei's 3x zoom matches Xiaomi's 3.2x, but Huawei achieves this through digital zoom on the main camera, which can't compete with Xiaomi's true optical telephoto. Comparing Huawei's 4x telephoto to Xiaomi's 4.3x, Huawei brightens dark areas on the truck to preserve visibility and produce a clearer overall image. However, it struggles with fine textures like tire details, which become distorted during processing. Xiaomi takes the opposite approach, essentially giving up on dark areas and focusing entirely on bright details. This turns shadows completely black, but the tire textures come out impressively sharp and well-defined. In this set of shots, Huawei focuses heavily on keeping the image clean, applying strong noise reduction that ends up softening some texture details, especially around the headlights in the brighter areas. Xiaomi handles those same highlights better and manages to retain more texture. Looking at another group of images, Huawei again smooths the cement wall quite aggressively to remove what it considers noise, which also wipes out many of the subtle marks on the surface. Details inside the window are reduced as well, all in the name of balancing exposure. Xiaomi, once it identifies the scene as a building, switches on texture enhancement. It deliberately boosts contrast on the wall, making scratches stand out clearly, and it also lifts darker details inside the window. Moving to 6.22x zoom, which matches the optical focal length of Huawei's second telephoto lens, Xiaomi reaches the same zoom level using digital zoom from its telephoto camera. In real-world results, the gap between the two isn't as big as you might expect. If you look very closely, Huawei comes out slightly sharper, but the difference is minimal. At 10x zoom, both phones rely entirely on digital zoom from their telephoto lenses. Huawei interprets the blurry marks on the wall as possible edges and reconstructs them into clean, vertical lines. Xiaomi doesn't exaggerate these small imperfections and instead presents a more natural-looking image. That said, when the subject contains very clear, structured lines, Huawei really shows its strength. The touchpad with its uniform grid pattern is reconstructed almost perfectly by Huawei's enhancement system, making the image look crisp and well-defined. Xiaomi struggles here as it doesn't actively boost those regular lines, leading to lower perceived resolution and softness. At 30x zoom, Huawei continues to prioritize image purity. Complex textures are simplified, so the tassels under the lantern turn into thick, simplified lines. Xiaomi's image is blurrier overall, but it stays closer to what the lantern actually looks like. The same behavior appears when photographing the tower sculpture. Huawei uses recognition and line redrawing to create a simplified but clear image that feels flat. Xiaomi's version is softer but maintains more depth and three-dimensionality. When it comes to high-resolution telephoto modes, Huawei offers 50 megapixel shooting, while Xiaomi supports 200 megapixels. In both usability and the way details and textures are rendered, Xiaomi has a clear advantage. The higher resolution also makes Xiaomi's images more flexible for cropping and recomposing later. Switching to the lens used for window corners, Huawei's correction algorithm feels overly aggressive, causing jagged edges on lines that aren't perfectly vertical. Its HDR approach, again aimed at keeping the image clean, sacrifices detail in darker glass areas. Xiaomi applies less correction, resulting in more natural lines and better shadow retention. In portrait mode, Huawei produces deeper skin tones and darker eyebrows, creating stronger contrast that emphasizes facial contours. Xiaomi delivers lighter skin tones and softer eyebrows, giving portraits a gentler, more natural appearance. In terms of fine detail, though, there isn't a huge gap. The biggest difference is the overall focusing and rendering style. For macro shots, Huawei clearly has the upper hand. It can focus much closer, making details like watch markings and hands easy to see. Xiaomi needs about 30 centimeters to lock focus in macro mode, suggesting its telephoto lens is optimized more for long-distance work at the expense of close-up performance. Looking at the front cameras in backlit scenes, Huawei brightens faces more, while Xiaomi's results are slightly darker. Huawei's skin rendering looks finer, whereas Xiaomi emphasizes texture more strongly. At night, especially when shooting nearby objects like shared bicycles, the biggest difference is tonal rendering. Huawei pushes contrast and saturation, while Xiaomi's colors are more subdued but closer to reality. The difference becomes clearer in distant night scenes. Huawei darkens the edges of the frame to improve overall clarity, which can turn window areas completely black and erase detail. Xiaomi keeps more detail visible, using gentler noise reduction that reveals the structure of those windows. In brighter lighting, Huawei's heavy-handed processing starts to show its weaknesses. In trying to maintain clarity, it oversuppresses highlights like light boxes, making clipping more obvious. Aggressive sharpening and contrast enhancement exaggerate edges and even minor color differences, leading to visible purple fringing. Xiaomi's smoother edge handling and restrained contrast control do a much better job with highlights. This isn't a one-off issue either. Zooming into the highlight areas in these photos reveals the same problems again. Similar behavior appears when switching to the telephoto lenses. In bright scenes, Huawei smooths out fine textures around headlights almost completely, turning them into flat color patches. Xiaomi performs much better here. In dimmer scenes, the situation flips. Huawei retains clearer window outlines on buildings, while Xiaomi's image becomes so dark that details nearly disappear. At 10x zoom, both phones perform similarly, with minor flaws showing up around small lightbox details. Switching to the ultra-wide lens, Huawei's edge enhancement looks unnatural, making building edges appear jagged and uneven. Xiaomi's ultra-wide results are noticeably cleaner and more natural. For front-facing photos in low light, both phones offer face brightening and fill light, but Huawei stands out with better clarity and detail retention. In video recording, stabilization is comparable on both devices, with Huawei having a slight edge. Xiaomi's highlight handling is a bit weaker, occasionally blowing out bright areas. For front-facing video, though, both phones are essentially on the same level. To wrap things up, the Huawei 80 Pro Max and Xiaomi 17 Ultra represent two very different approaches to photography. With modern smartphones, image quality is largely driven by algorithms, and that leads to clearly distinct visual styles. AI processing can be impressive in certain situations, but it also makes mistakes. In the end, it really comes down to which look you prefer. That's it for this review. If you found it useful, don't forget to like and subscribe to support the channel. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.